To access all audiobook recordings without ad interruptions, please visit the links below. Thank you for your support. Blood Lies by Grover Furr. Chapter 13. Bloodlands Chapter 10. Accusations of Soviet crimes near the war's end. Expulsion of German colonists, like Soviet expulsion of Polish settlers. Snyder says of the Germans expelled from Poland at the war's end, quote, "Perhaps 1.5 million of them were German administrators and colonists, who would never have come to Poland without Hitler's war. They lived in houses or apartments that they had taken from Poles expelled or killed during the war, or from Jews who had been killed," end quote. But the same had been true of the Polish imperialist settlers, Polish Osadnicy, sent by the Polish state after 1921 to Polonize western Ukraine and Belarusia, the areas seized by Poland from Soviet Russia by military conquest, but in which Poles were a minority. Echoing Snyder's words, they were indeed Polish administrators and colonists who would never have come to western Belarusia and western Ukraine without Pilsudski's war. These lands were east of the Curzon Line. It is impossible to understand the history of this period and region without reference to the Curzon Line, but Snyder never mentions it even once in Bloodlands. He writes of these areas as though they were naturally part of Poland and therefore that there was something unnatural, unjust, etc., that they should be reunited with eastern Belarusia and eastern Ukraine within the USSR. In reality, Poland had conquered these lands through an imperialist war and treated their Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Jewish populations like colonial subjects in an imperialist, that is, brutal and racist manner. Poles murdered Polish Jews. There were also many cases of Poles murdering Jews during the war to take their property and of Poles blackmailing Jews not to turn them in to the Germans until the Jews ran out of money and then turning them in. The cruelty and greed of these blackmailers is commonly portrayed in accounts by Jews who hid in Poland during the war. This is yet another way in which capitalist Poland resembles Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union was completely different. No one, not even Snyder, has ever accused the Soviet army or Soviet citizens of acting in this way against Soviet Jews. After the war was over, there were many cases of Poles murdering Jews in order to keep the property they had taken from them while the Jews had been in hiding. The Polish Home Army, now underground freedom fighters, and other Polish bands and gangs killed a great many Jews, sometimes for their property, sometimes because, like the Nazis, many Polish nationalists equated Judaism with communism, sometimes because they did not consider Jews to be Poles and wanted Poland cleaned of Jews, just as the Nazis did. Since he cites a number of the works produced by the researchers at the Center for the Holocaust, Snyder must know about these things, but few of his readers will know about them, and Snyder remains silent about them. Rapes of German Women by Red Army Soldiers, quote, "During the March on Berlin, the Red Army followed a dreadfully simple procedure in the eastern lands of the Reich, the territories meant for Poland. Its men raped German women and seized German men and some women for labor. The behavior continued as the soldiers reached the German lands that would remain in Germany and finally Berlin. Red Army soldiers had also raped women in Poland and in Hungary and even in Yugoslavia, where a communist revolution would make the country a Soviet ally. Yugoslav communists complained to Stalin about the behavior of Soviet soldiers, who gave them a little lecture about soldiers and fun." Source, Note 7, page 498. Yugoslav quotation, Naimark, Russians, page 71, end quote. Snyder does not tell his readers the source here, which is Milovan Delage's book, Conversations with Stalin, published in 1961. It appeared long after A, the events described, B, the very hostile break between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, and C, Delage's own rejection of communism. So Delage's account, published 17 years after the fact, might be inaccurate because of his bias. Delages hated Stalin, and by 1961 had come to hate communism because the passage of time had reshaped his memory of events, or because he had fabricated it, or it might be accurate, we can't know. The historical principle of testis unis, testis nullis means that a single witness or a piece of evidence to an event is not enough to establish that the event actually occurred. This short passage illustrates why good historians insist upon source criticism, an examination of the source of the evidence. Any lawyer knows the importance of sources. If a defendant or a witness claims that a third party made a certain statement, opposing counsel is sure to ask, "What is your source? How do we know that statement is genuine?" But Snyder doesn't do this. He never does when it might call into question an otherwise perfectly good anti-Stalin or anti-communist statement. So, did Stalin say this? Given the source, we can't be sure. But one thing is certain. Stalin's alleged statement has nothing whatsoever to do with any rapes in Germany. Alleges states that it was made during his trip to Moscow during the winter of 1944 to 1945, page 93. The war against Hitler was far from over, and allegations of rape against German women had not yet been made. Bottom line, we don't know whether Stalin made this statement, i.e. whether Alleges was reporting the truth or writing anti-communist propaganda, but we know it was not made with reference to Red Army rapes in Germany. Neither Nymork nor Snyder point this fact out. On pages 316 to 318, Snyder expatiates upon the widespread story of mass rapes of German women by Red Army soldiers. There are many Russian responses to this accusation, most of them defensive, some of them quoting accounts of exemplary treatment of German women by Red Army soldiers. There are also accounts of the rape of German women by Red Army soldiers who were then tried and shot or imprisoned. None of them have the kinds of well-founded total numbers that we would like to have. The whole question has become so ideologically charged that it is hardly possible to get objective information. Nazi propaganda claimed a great many rapes in order to strengthen resistance to the Red Army. Anti-communist propaganda since the war has made the claim of massive rape a central focus. So what was the situation? Were there more rapes than could be expected by Red Army men of German women? Most people want simple answers, but there aren't any simple answers here. The massive rape story is mainly spread by professional anti-communists who are not objective about anything else, so there's no reason to think they are objective in this matter either. It has never even been established that there was a higher rate of rape by Red Army men, number of confirmed rapes divided by the number of soldiers, than there was in the other Allied armies. Also, the Red Army occupied areas that had sided with the Nazis and participated in the unprecedented slaughter of civilians and murder of Red Army prisoners, whereas much of the areas occupied by the Allies were anti-German. Other factors. German women could get abortions by claiming rape by a Soviet soldier, which must have led to some false claims. Allied soldiers could pay for sex with desperate women with food, cigarettes, or other goods. Such arrangements were not considered rape, though women in desperate need often had no choice. The question of rape by American soldiers, evidently encouraged by U.S. Army propaganda, moreover in friendly countries such as France rather than in pro-Nazi countries, whose soldiers had participated in enormous atrocities in the USSR like Hungary, Romania, and Germany, has only recently begun to attract some attention. Footnote. Jennifer Schlusser, The Dark Side of Liberation, New York Times, May 21st, 2013, page C1. End of footnote. The issue seems to be that publicity about rape by Red Army soldiers started some years earlier than that about rape by American soldiers and has been vigorously promoted for anti-communist purposes, as Snyder is doing. Was there a high incidence of rape in the liberated USSR? I have attempted to survey the Russian language literature on this question. As far as I can tell, no one has alleged that this was the case. That tends to make me suspect that anger and resentment towards Germans and their allies were a major factor in whatever rapes occurred. So in one respect, this is part of the anti-communist numbers game to fabricate or multiply alleged Soviet atrocities. On the other hand, given the unprecedented level of atrocities and destruction inflicted on the USSR by the German armies, it would be surprising if there were not a higher level of rape of German, Hungarian, Romania, etc. women by Red Army men than there were among Allied soldiers. But it is impossible to get any precise figures, so we really do not know. Historians ought to admit ignorance on the basis of lack of good evidence, which is very often the case. But lack of evidence does not stop ideological anti-communists from drawing the conclusions they desire and then using their own fictions to moralize in the manner of Joseph Goebbels' diaries. Quote, as so often, Stalin's crimes were enabled by Hitler's policies, end quote. As so often, what? What crimes? Snyder has yet to establish a single crime of Stalin's. This is Snyder's anti-communism in overdrive again. It seems clear that Snyder will stoop to any propaganda technique in order to dishonestly associate the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. Snyder barely refers to the real genocide, the Volhynian massacres. Quote, The Germans had killed about 1.3 million Jews in the former Eastern Poland in 1941 and 1942 with the help of local policemen. Some of these Ukrainian policemen helped to form a Ukrainian partisan army in 1943, which, under the leadership of Ukrainian nationalists, cleansed the former southwest Poland, which it saw as Western Ukraine, of remaining Poles. The OUN Bandera, the nationalist organization that led the partisan army, had long pledged to rid Ukraine of its national minorities. Its capacity to kill Poles depended upon German training, and its determination to kill Poles had much to do with its desire to clear the terrain of purported enemies before a final confrontation with the Red Army. The UPA, as the partisan army was known, murdered tens of thousands of Poles and provoked reprisals from Poles upon Ukrainian civilians. End quote. Sources: Note 34, page 500. Documentation of the UPA's plans for and action toward Poles can be found in TS Davo 3833186 6A, 38331 13 through 14, 38331 86 19 through 20, and 39333160. Of related interest are DAR 3116 equals USHMM RG 31.017M1, DAR 30115, USHMM RG 31.017M1, and DAR 314, USHMM RG 31017M1. These OUNB and UPA wartime declarations coincide with post-war interrogations, CGARF R 9478-1-398, and recollections of Polish survivors on the massacre of 12th through 13th July 1943, for example, see OKAW 2-737-2-1144, 2-2099, 2-2650, 2-953, and 2-775, and Jewish survivors, for example, ZIH 301-2519, and Adini Dubno, Sefer Zikaron 717-718. The fundamental study is now Metoika. See also Ilyushin, OUN-UPA, and Armstrong, Ukrainian nationalism. I sought to explain this conflict in Causes, Reconstruction, Life and Death, and Sketches. This page contains the only reference in Bloodlands to the Volhynian massacres of 50,000 to 100,000 or more Polish civilians by Ukrainian nationalist forces armed by the Germans but acting on their own initiative. Snyder has researched these important and neglected mass murders and has published on them in the past. Yet, he neglects them in Bloodlands. Why? This was true genocide, an attempt to kill so many Poles that survivors would flee and rid the Ukraine of Poles completely. Even if the Soviet NKVD or army had been guilty of killing all the Katyn Poles, and we can now be certain that the official version of the Katyn massacre is false, that would be less than half to less than 1/4 of the numbers of Poles murdered by the Ukrainian nationalists. Yet the Volhynian massacres are scarcely ever discussed. Snyder himself spends only 1/2 of one paragraph on it. Why? Snyder follows contemporary Polish nationalist practice in virtually ignoring the Volhynian massacres in Bloodlands. The reason for this neglect seems to be that it is highly embarrassing to today's Ukrainian nationalists who heap praise upon the Ukrainian nationalist forces as anti-Bolshevik freedom fighters, despite the fact that they fought on the side of the Nazis and murdered at the very least hundreds of thousands of Jews and Poles. The state of Ukraine has periodically declared the same forces who were guilty of these horrific and massive atrocities, the OUN Bandera, the 14th SS Division, Galazin, later renamed the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, to be heroes. It can hardly be a coincidence that the Volhynian massacres are also neglected in today's right-wing capitalist Poland. Poland follows what is often called the Giedroyc doctrine, named for anti-communist political theorist Jerzy Giedroyc, who proposed that the mass murders by Ukrainian nationalists be forgotten in the interests of good relations with post-Soviet Ukraine, while the Katyn massacres be emphasized as a political tool against Russia. According to Polish historian Bogumil Grot, quote, I still remember how Jerzy Gadroic, in a radio interview given just 2 weeks before his death, briefly summed up the problem of the UPA murders of Poles. We must forget them. End quote. Since Snyder follows this practice, we note that he expresses his gratitude towards Jerzy Gadroic. Quote, the late Jerzy Gadroic helped me to ask some of the right questions. End quote. In the immediate post-Soviet period, Polish researchers finally began to publish lengthy, well-documented accounts of the really hair-raising atrocities committed by Ukrainian nationalist soldiers against Polish civilians in order to drive them out of western Ukraine. This brought attention to these horrific mass murders for the first time and caused a lot of embarrassment between anti-communist Poland and anti-communist Ukraine. In 2003, the two highly anti-communist states organized a sort of reconciliation conference. Since that time, the Polish side has relented somewhat. Both sides agreed that it was a long time ago and everybody who did it is dead. Not true, of course, even today, much less a decade ago. They evidently want to bury the hatchet about all these mass murders, including retributive killings of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 Ukrainian civilians by Polish forces, so they could get back to their primary business, blaming Stalin, communism, the Soviet Union, and Russia for all bad things. This attempt at cover-up has been underway for the past decade. The more publicity the Volhynian massacres get, the worse the anti-communist Ukrainian and Polish forces seem. Even the Katyn massacre pales in comparison, and this tells us something about the enormous publicity and propaganda given in today's Poland to Katyn. Clearly, this is not at all about the victims, but about anti-communism, and also about keeping anti-Russian sentiment alive. Polish nationalism is largely based on anti-Russian propaganda. This is a plausible hypothesis to explain why Snyder devotes less than a paragraph to these massacres. Snyder asserts that the book by his friend Gregor Zmoyska, Ukrainska Partizanka, 1942-1960, is now the fundamental study. Hardly. Motoika's book is only partly about the Volhynian massacres. Much of the rest of it is about the heroic struggle of Ukrainian nationalist and fascist partisans against the Soviets. Motoika has been a member of the Polish Institute of the People's Memory, a fanatically nationalist research propaganda group funded by the Polish government and innocent of any aim at objectivity. The IPN's president takes an oath to the Polish people. This is reminiscent of Nazi practice. Who is to define what constitutes loyalty to the people, and who are the people anyway? Moreover, historians are supposed to be loyal to the truth, not to their own Volk. Imagine what American historians would think of an organization named Institute of the American People's Memory. It would be immediately recognized as a far-right nationalist effort and scorned by all respected historians. The IPN is primarily anti-communist and anti-Soviet. No objective historian would associate with it, just as no objective historian would associate with the Hoover Institution in Palo Alto, California, a similar anti-communist propaganda mill in the guise of a research center. Yet Motoika appears to disagree with Snyder on the question of the Volhynian massacres. Motoika wrote a long essay in Gazeta Wyborcza titled Forget About Gidruk, Poles, Ukrainians, and the IPN. He takes the position that the Ukrainian massacres of Poles were one of the bloodiest Polish episodes of the Second World War and must not be forgotten. Motoika does not shrink from calling these massacres genocide. Motoika also admits that some actions of the Polish underground could also be called genocide, such as the murders of some dozen of Belarusians in 1946 or murders of 200 Ukrainians in June 1945, both after the war. According to Motoika, there are very few memorials concerning these horrific mass murders in Poland today. Quote, it is shameful that places like the mass grave in Porosla, Volhynia, can only be reached by a forest path cut through the wilderness, end quote. Motoika makes the gesture of mentioning Soviet crimes and falsely claims that the Soviets wanted to annihilate class enemies, something the Soviets never advocated. These are general remarks apparently obligatory for Polish historians today. If the Soviets or pro-Soviet partisans had ever done anything remotely resembling the mass murders carried out not only by Ukrainian nationalist forces, but by the Polish Home Army and the NSZ underground in response to the Ukrainian mass murders, the whole world would have known about it for decades. There would be many large, expensive memorials to the victims, a library of books exposing the communist atrocities, and no doubt lawsuits for damages before the European Court of Human Rights. The reality is that there is no evidence that the Soviets and pro-Soviet forces ever did anything like this. This is another reminder that it is the Polish and Ukrainian freedom fighters rather than the Soviet Union who most resemble the Nazis. The point, though, is that Motoika does not advocate downplaying Ukrainian massacres as in practice Snyder does. The fundamental study of these horrendous events remains that by Vladislav and Iwa Samasko. A number of books are available in Russian. For a brief English introduction, see the internet page, Genocide Committed by Ukrainian Nationalists in Occupied Poland. The eagerness of Polish and Ukrainian nationalist elites to bury the hatchet over 50,000 to 100,000 or more atrocious murders contrasts with the Polish elites' never-ending complaints about the Katyn massacres, which comprised 1/4 or 1/7 the number of victims. Moreover, as we have discussed in a previous chapter, the official version has now been definitively disproven. In like manner, Snyder devotes less than a paragraph to these horrifying massacres, while inventing Soviet atrocities left and right. More false numbers of victims. Quote, between 1944 and 1946, for example, 182,543 Ukrainians were deported from Soviet Ukraine to the Gulag, not for committing a particular crime, not even for being Ukrainian nationalists, but for being related to or acquainted with Ukrainian nationalists. At about the same time, in 1946 and 1947, the Soviets sentenced 148,079 Red Army veterans to the Gulag for collaboration with the Germans. There were never more Soviet citizens in the Gulag than in the years after the war. Indeed, the number of Soviet citizens in the camps and special settlements increased every year from 1945 until Stalin's death. End quote. Sources, note 36, page 500. On the 182,543 Ukrainians deported from Soviet Ukraine to the Gulag, see Viner Nature, page 1137. On the 148,079 Red Army veterans, see Polian Violence, 129. See also Generally Applebaum, Gulag, 463. In an article published since Bloodlands, Snyder claimed even more. Quote, at war's end, the Ukrainian nationalists were defeated by the Soviets, who killed tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and deported hundreds of thousands more to concentration camps. End quote. This is all false. Snyder presents no evidence whatsoever that any Ukrainian civilians were killed, much less tens of thousands. According to the authoritative collection of Soviet documents published by the highly anti-communist Memorial Society in 2005, the number of all persons deported from the Ukraine between 1944 and 1948 inclusive is 131,935. This number includes 16,996 persons from the following groups: German repatriates, family members of convicted traitors, convicted German citizens of the USSR, e.g. Volga Germans called Volksdeutsch, and those who had served in German military or police formations. Subtracting these, the total number of Ukrainian nationalists is 114,969. Another possible total number from the same report is 114,936. Stalinitsky deportatsy, 630 to 631. These people were not sent to camps, but were exiled to the eastern USSR. Snyder cites an article by Amir Viner published in 1999. The citation and its footnote may be found in the appendix to this chapter. As usual, the devil is in the details. The evidence. Viner's figure of 110,825 nationalists killed, see the first quotation in the appendix to this chapter, comes from a secondary source written by a Ukrainian nationalist, as does the figure 182,543, deported between 1944 and 1952. The number from Nikolai Fedorovich Bugai, the leading Russian scholar on deportations, covers the years 1939 to 1945, meaning all the Polish settlers deported from the western Ukraine in 1939 to 1940, as well as during the war. Bugai explicitly includes deportations of Germans and others from this area. Bugai, page 12, page 13, it tells us nothing about the period from 1944 onward. Viner claims the Soviets emphasized almost total annihilation since they repeatedly failed to mention prisoners taken alive. This is false. Viner is in error. Bugai is the acknowledged Russian specialist on deportations and is conventionally anti-communist and anti-Stalin. In the appendix to this chapter, the reader will find primary source evidence printed by Bugai with emphasis added at the passages referring to the large number of prisoners taken. Bugai cites primary sources, Beria's reports to Stalin, that speak of tens of thousands of prisoners and those who have turned themselves in. Elsewhere, Viner uses and cites Bugai's work. So how can Viner, Snyder's source here, state that the campaign against nationalists was a war without prisoners? How can he talk about NKVD reports failing to mention prisoners taken alive, emphasizing almost total annihilation? The answer appears to be that Weiner doesn't use Bugai here. Instead, he cites Ukrainian nationalist historians. Ukrainian nationalists, like Polish, Baltic, etc. nationalists, have every reason to falsify and exaggerate Soviet atrocities. This is the only way they have to try to excuse or at least explain the important role Ukrainian nationalist forces played in the Holocaust of the Jews and in the Volhynian massacres of 50,000 to 100,000 or more Polish civilians. The Soviets did indeed kill tens of thousands in the Ukraine, not civilians, as Snyder falsely claims, but OUN UPA fighters. No country would fail to combat armed bands within its own territory. Moreover, these forces had fought on the Nazi side and helped carry out the Holocaust, to say nothing of the mass murders of Polish and Soviet civilians. As for the number deported, Snyder's claim of hundreds of thousands deported to concentration camps is fallacious. Sovietsky Deportatsy, the collection of primary sources cited above, published in 2005, gives the figure of 37,145 persons during 1944 to 1946. Polian Violence 129 cites same number, 148,079. Here is the passage. Quote, in 1946 to 1947, 148,079 Vlasovites were exiled for a period of 6 years with the status of labor colonists to the most inhospitable regions of the USSR. End quote. Polian's source is a Russian study published in 1992 by Guboglo and Kuznetsov. However, it's just as likely that Polian just copied this from the end of the 12th chapter of the notorious Black Book of Communism, since both the same number and the same reference are given. Snyder, remember, said that these were Red Army veterans and then referred to Polian, but his own source, Polian, calls them Vlasovians, men who had been recruited to Nazi armies, such as the Vaslov Army. Snyder has lied about this to make it look to the reader as though Red Army soldiers were sent to the Gulag. Applebaum, Gulag 463, contains no information of relevance to this paragraph. Snyder continues, quote, in a few days in October 1947, some 76,192 Ukrainians were transported to the Gulag. Sources, note 38, page 501, Metoika Ukrainska Partizanka, 535, end quote. Metoika Ukrainska Partizanska, 535, does give number 76,192, but Snyder has falsified what occurred. In fact, they were not sent to the Gulag, that is, to camps, but were exiled. The relevant document by Kroglov, minister of the MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, successor to the NKVD, may be found in the appendix to this chapter. Snyder cares about elites. About other people, not so much. Snyder, quote, men of elite families were killed at Katyn and other sites, end quote. Let's set aside for a moment the fact that Snyder has not even tried to establish what happened at Katyn, nor to inform his readers of the scholarly controversy that exists over this event. Footnote. In reality, as we have argued earlier in this book, the official version of the Katyn massacre cannot possibly be true, a fact that anti-communists try to hide at any cost. See also Furr, official version. End of footnote. Once again, it is revealing that Snyder cares about elites so much. It is an example of Snyder's deeply reactionary way of thinking. Of course, it is a historical truism that all progressive social and political upheavals and revolutions target elites, slave revolts, and peasant revolts throughout history. The English Revolution of the mid-17th century, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the United States defeat of the Confederacy in the American Civil War, the Russian Revolution, the Yugoslav, Chinese, and Vietnamese revolutions, and many others, all disproportionately target elites because those elites were the exploiters or their agents. History shows that the common working people can do without the wealthy elites very well indeed. Quote, leading about 120,000 special forces, he, Lavrenti Beria, rounded up and expelled 478,479 people in just over a week. Because no Chechens or Ingush were to be left behind, people who could not be moved were shot. Villages were burned to the ground everywhere. In some places, barns full of people were burned as well. Sources, note 41, page 501. See Polian Against Their Will, 134 to 155, for all of the cited figures. See also Neimark Fires, 96. Lieberman, Terrible Fate, 206 to 207. Burleigh, Third Reich, 749, end quote. Snyder is wrong again. There is no evidence that anyone who could not be moved was shot, nor that any villages were burned to the ground, much less everywhere, nor that barns full of people were burned as well. The story about one barn of people being burned alive, not multiple barns, as Snyder claims, is a forgery, probably American in origin due to the clumsy literal translation into Russian of American intelligence slang. It is thoroughly discussed and refuted in the two works cited in this footnote. Snyder fails to inform his readers about this research. Does he even know anything about this issue? If not, why write about it, except to make anti-communist propaganda? Lieberman, Terrible Fate, 206 to 207, quotes a Chechen nationalist source that records only that some people did die on the journey. It does not record the number, for which see below. Nikolai Bugai is the most authoritative Russian expert on deportations, and an anti-Stalinist to boot. Here is what he has written, quote, Operation Chetsvitsa, which began on 23rd February, was completed sometime during the third week of March. NKVD records attest to 180 convoy trains carrying 493,269 Chechen and English nationals and members of other nationalities seized at the same time. 50 people were killed in the course of the operation, and 1,272 died on the journey. Other reports indicate that during the Chechen military actions and the resettlement of 2,016 Chechen and English anti-Soviet elements were arrested, and 20,072 firearms and 479 submachine guns were confiscated. End quote. Footnote. N.F. Bugai and A.M. Gonov, The Forced Evacuation of the Chechens in the English, Russian Studies in History, Volume 41, Number 2, Fall 2002, pages 43 to 61 at page 56. End of footnote. Neimark Fires of Hatred 96 agrees with Bugai. The NKVD reported only sporadic cases of resistance. Footnote. An associate of the Hoover Institution, Neimark is an ideological anti-communist. So he writes, anyone who resisted was shot. There is no evidence for this assertion. It is likely that those who offered armed resistance were shot, but they were few. End of footnote. The numbers game again, falsified once more. Snyder writes, quote, in all of the civil conflict, fight, deportation, and resettlement provoked or caused by the return of the Red Army between 1943 and 1947, some 700,000 Germans died, as did at least 150,000 Poles and perhaps 250,000 Ukrainians. At a minimum, another 300,000 Soviet citizens died during or shortly after the Soviet deportations from the Caucasus, Crimea, Moldova, and the Baltic states. If the struggles of Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian nationalists against the reimposition of Soviet power are regarded as resistance to deportations, which in some measure they were, another 100,000 or so people would have to be added to the total dead associated with ethnic cleansing. Sources, note 43, page 501, Viner, Nature, 1137, notes that the Soviets reported killing 110,825 people as Ukrainian nationalists between February 1944 and May 1946. The NKVD estimated that 144,705 Chechens, English, Bulgars, and Karachai died as a result of deportation or shortly after resettlement by 1948. See Lieberman, Terrible Fate, 207, end quote. Snyder gives no source at all for his figures of the deaths of 700,000 Germans, at least 150,000 Poles, and perhaps 250,000 Ukrainians, nor does he give any evidence for his blaming the Red Army for whatever deaths did occur. Viner's fraudulent claim of 110,825 people killed has been refuted above. Snyder gives no evidence for the deaths of 100,000 Baltic nationalists. Nor does he tell his readers that Nazi collaborators in the Baltics and Baltic participants in the Holocaust described themselves as nationalists, hoping that the word nationalist would justify their anti-Soviet terrorism. We should recall that all fascists justified their fascism as nationalism. As for this claim of Snyder's, quote, The NKVD estimated that 144,705 Chechens, Ingush, Bulgars, and Karachai died as a result of deportation or shortly after resettlement by 1948. See Lieberman, Terrible Fate 207, end quote. This, too, is a falsification. We have seen that Bugai published the NKVD report that 50 Chechen and Ingush died during deportation. We have no way of knowing how many of the 493,000 who were deported would have died during the same time period had they remained in their villages. Surely some would have, so the 1,272 who died on the journey cannot all be persons who would not have died as a result of the deportation. During 1946 to 1947, there was a serious famine in the USSR. The famine was caused by catastrophic weather conditions. No doubt it was made even worse by the massive destruction of the war. Nor was the famine not only confined to the USSR, according to Stephen Wheatcroft, who has written the latest study of the Soviet famine of 1946 to 1947. Quote, "The world food crisis of 1946 to 1947 was the most serious global food shortage of modern history, when the famine simultaneously threatened Eastern and Central Europe, India, Indochina, and China, and bread rationing was introduced in Britain for the first time ever. The British and American governments had requested food aid from Stalin to ease the world food crisis before they became aware of the situation in the USSR. The international context of the Soviet famine of 1946 to 1947 was strikingly different to 1921, when America had been able to provide large amounts of relief grain to Russia." End quote. Footnote. Wheatcroft. The Soviet famine of 1946 to 1947, The Weather and Human Agency in Historical Perspective, Europe, Asia Studies, 64-6, 2002, page 1004. End of footnote. Claiming that deaths of whatever number by 1948 were a result of deportation is plainly dishonest. As Snyder notes, Lieberman makes this claim on page 207 of his book. His source is an early book of Bugai, who cites the number 144,704. Bugai wrote, quote, "According to the NKVD Department on Special Settlements, among all deported Chechens, Ingush, Bulgarians 1944, and Karachai 1943 during the 1944 to 1948, 144,704 persons died, 23.7%, i.e. in Kazakhstan, 101,036 Chechen, Ingush, and Bulgarians in Uzbekistan, 16,052, 10.6% persons during a 6-month stay. In 1948, 13,883 persons, 9.8%. End quote. Footnote. Nikolai F. Bugai, The Deportation of Peoples in the Soviet Union, New York, Nova Science Publishers, 1996, page 98. End of footnote. In the same article, Bugai also says that between 1944 and 1946, quote, 1,468 deported people died in Kazakhstan, end quote. This refutes the accusation that those who died by 1948 died as a result of deportation. Neither Lieberman nor Snyder mentions this fact, nor do they calculate the number of deaths above the normal mortality rate for the large population there. Bugai also discusses the extra provisions allotted by the Soviet state to deportees, page 117 FF. Immediately after the paragraph above, Bugai adds the sentence, "The number of sources for this study is very poor." Neither Lieberman nor Snyder mention that either. In fact, this short book by Bugai, published in English in 1996, is the translation of an article published in 1989 that is before the end of the USSR. Better documentation began to appear after the end of the USSR in 1991. In 1998, Bugai and his associate Gomov wrote the account quoted above. It appears that he does not repeat the death figures he cited in 1989. Lieberman, 206 to 207, repeats undocumented stories of many deaths during the deportation. Bugai relates some of them too, but he also reports the official accounts above. As others have suggested, it is very likely that the official and very low estimates of deaths are accurate. There would certainly have been a head count at the end of the journey. Discrepancies would have raised the suspicion that, for example, NKVD men might have let some persons escape in exchange for bribes. Therefore, it is unlikely that many, if indeed any, persons died and were buried along the route in addition to those reported. In his 1992 book, Bugaj quotes selections of a report of the Section of Special Resettlement of the NVD of the USSR concerning work among those resettled and dated April 10, 1953, where the same number of those who died, 144,705, is also cited. Quote, from the moment of resettlement, February 1944, to the present time, in the special settlements, 82,391 people have been born, including children of former kulaks, 22,209, Germans, 22,210, Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, and Karachay, 26,002, and others, 11,970. The greatest percentage of mortality is among those special resettled persons who were resettled in 1944. Of the total number of persons resettled in that year to the present time, there have died Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, Karachay, 23.7%, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Greeks, Armenians, 19.6%, Kalmyks, 17.4%, Turks, Kurds, Kimshashuv, 14.6%, end quote. It appears as though the relevant figures are for the period between the moment of resettlement, i.e. of deportation, to the present time, that is, between 1944 and 1953. Footnote. Because of the excerpted nature of the documents Bugaj cites, it is impossible to be certain what the period of time is. End of footnote. This would contradict Bugaj's earlier statement that the period in question was 1944 to 1948. Why did Stalin reject Marshall Plan aid? Quote, in 1947, the United States, offered economic aid in the form of the Marshall Plan to European countries willing to cooperate with one another on elementary matters of trade and financial policy. Stalin could reject Marshall aid and force his clients to reject it as well. End quote. The Soviet Union did reject Marshall Plan aid because it appeared to be an attempt to subvert its influence in Europe. Jeffrey Roberts writes, quote, although the Americans were thinking mainly in terms of Western Europe, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were not excluded from the proposed aid program. Indeed, the British and French governments responded to Marshall's Harvard speech by inviting the Russians to a conference in Paris to discuss a European response to the plan. In Moscow, however, the Soviets were in two minds. On the one hand, they welcomed the possibility of American loans and grants for themselves and for their East European allies. On the other, they feared that the Marshall Plan was an economic counterpart of the Truman Doctrine, a means of using American financial muscle to build an anti-Soviet alliance in Western Europe. At the Parents' Conference in July 1947, Moscow's worst fears were realized. The British and French insisted, in accordance with Marshall's express wishes, that any American aid program had to be co-coordinated and organized on a pan-Europe basis. This was seen by the Soviets as a Western device for interference in the economic and political life of the East European countries. Such interference was completely unacceptable to Stalin. Consequently, the USSR withdrew from all negotiations concerning the Marshall Plan and insisted its East European allies did not participate either. End quote. Footnote. Historians and the Cold War. History Review, December 2000. End of footnote. Did non-collectivized agriculture save the Ukraine from famine? Quote, Ukrainians returned to a country where famine was raging again. Perhaps 1 million people starved to death in the 2 years after the war. It was Western Ukraine, with a private agricultural sector that the Soviets had not yet had time to collectivize, that saved the rest of Soviet Ukraine from even greater suffering. Source, note 44, page 501. Survivors of the famine mention this in their memoirs. See Petitioners, 1946 to 1947 famine, page 185, end quote. Petitioner's study is published in a right-wing Ukrainian nationalist book and is not referred to by any expert scholars on the subject. The latest study of the 1946 to 1947 famine is that by Stephen Wheatcroft. Snyder offers no evidence that uncollectivized Western Ukraine saved the Soviet Union in the famine of 1947, or indeed that collectivization had anything to do at all with the famine. As the quotation from Wheatcroft's article cited above shows, there was still a bread shortage in the UK, although, of course, agriculture was not collectivized there. Wheatcroft says nothing specifically about the harvest in Western Ukraine. End of chapter 13.